Welcome to josephsmithspolygamy.org, the audio version. Joseph Smith and plural marriage in the 1830s. It appears that Joseph Smith learned that plural marriage could be a divinely sanctioned practice sometime in the early 1830s. Whether he also learned at that time that it would someday be sanctioned in the church is unclear. Plural marriage experimentations were found among other religious groups, so its modern-day practice was not completely novel. The church was accused of practicing a community of wives in conjunction with the law of consecration as early as 1831, but there were no specific accusations of polygamy against Joseph Smith during this time span or at any time prior to 1842. When did Joseph Smith first become curious about plural marriage? Investigating the history of Joseph Smith and plural marriage naturally generates the question, when did he first contemplate the practice of polygamy? Several witnesses left accounts that it occurred in the early 1830s. Two of the plural wives that he married in Nauvoo recalled that Joseph Smith began questioning in 1831. Helen Mar Kimball wrote in 1884, "The Lord revealed it, plural marriage, to his prophet Joseph Smith as early as the year 1831. Lucy Walker testified in 1892 that plural marriage was revealed to the prophet in 31, but he did not teach it then. He received a revelation of polygamy in 1831. According to Orson Pratt, Lyman E. Johnson, who was a member of the first quorum of the 12 Apostles, recalled that Joseph had made known to him as early as 1831 that plural marriage was a correct principle. In 1869, Apostle Pratt remembered that when the prophet learned that plural marriage was sometimes divinely sanctioned, he was not then allowed to practice. In the forepart of the year 1832, Joseph told individuals then in the church that he had inquired of the Lord concerning the principle of plurality of wives, and he received for answer that the principle of taking more wives than one is a true principle, but the time had not yet come for it to be practiced. That was before the church was 2 years old. The Lord has his own time to do all things pertaining to his purposes in the last dispensation, his own time for restoring all things that have been practiced by the ancient prophets. Lyman O. Littlefield, who knew the prophet in Nauvoo, recalled in 1883, "I have the best reasons for believing it, celestial and plural marriage, was understood and believed by him," Joseph Smith the prophet, away back in the days when he lived in Kirtland. He was instructed of the Lord respecting the sacred ordinance of plural marriage, but he was not required to reveal it to the church until sometime during the residence of the saints in Nauvoo. In an 1886 article published in the Deseret News, Joseph F. Smith, then a member of the First Presidency, openly acknowledged, "The great and glorious principle of plural marriage was first revealed to Joseph Smith in 1831, but being forbidden to make it public or to teach it as doctrine of the gospel at that time, he confided the facts to only a very few of his intimate associates." 1831 Revelation, "Ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites." On June 19, 1831, Joseph Smith, W. W. Phelps, Martin Harris, Sidney Rigdon, and several others traveled to Jackson County, Missouri on a missionary journey, arriving there a few weeks later. On February 27, 1845, Thomas Bullock reported the comments of W. W. Phelps referring to that group. Phelps said 6 or 8 went over the boundaries of the U.S. to preach. Joseph Smith went to prayer. He then, the next part is indecipherable, something, a revelation, that Martin Harris was to marry among the Lamanites, that I was to preach day, and etc., etc. It was a long revelation. The contents of the described revelation are relevant to polygamy. In 1861, 30 years after the revelation was reportedly dictated, W. W. Phelps wrote a letter to President Young clarifying that experience. He then recited the substance of the revelation, identifying it as from Joseph Smith, Jr., given over the boundary west of Jackson County, Missouri, on Sunday morning, July 17, 1831. Phelps wrote in part, "Verily, verily, saith the Lord your Redeemer, even Jesus Christ, the light and the life of the world. Ye cannot discern with your natural eyes the design and the purpose of your Lord and your God, in bringing you thus far into the wilderness for a trial of your faith, and to be especial witnesses, to bear testimony of this land, upon which the Zion of God shall be built up in the last days, when it is redeemed. Verily I say unto you, that the wisdom of man in his fallen state knoweth not the purposes and the privileges of my holy priesthood. But ye shall know when ye receive a fullness by reason of the anointing. For it is my will that in time ye should take upon you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity may become white, delightsome, and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles." The details found in the Revelation raise questions whether Phelps was actually recalling its contents or was working from contemporaneous notes or from some other source. His statement that he was providing only the substance of the revelation is confusing because the text seems complete. That Phelps would bring this to the attention of President Young so many years after it occurred is curious and appears somewhat random. Phelps ended his letter to President Young writing, "About 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph Smith privately how we, that were mentioned in the Revelation, could take wives from the natives, as we were all married men. He replied instantly, in the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation." Corroborating Phelps' recollection is a contemporaneous letter from Ezra Booth, who wrote to Ira Eddy on December 6, 1831, saying, "It has been made known by revelation that it will be pleasing to the Lord should they form a matrimonial alliance with the natives. It has been made known to one who has left his wife in the state of New York that he is entirely free from his wife, and he is at pleasure to take him a wife from among the Lamanites." Despite Joseph Smith's apparent 1831 introduction to plural marriage and the reported revelation acknowledging it as sometimes divinely sanctioned, no polygamous unions were then formed. The revelation states, according to Phelps, "For it is my will that in time ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites." Apparently the opportunity did not present itself. Whatever Joseph taught at that time regarding plural marriage apparently did not make much of a stir among the early saints who heard it, because no other contemporaneous accounts are found. In addition, when the practice was started in Nauvoo, it appears that no one recalled it, and the prophet never referenced the incident. While translating the book of Genesis, Nauvoo polygamist Joseph B. Noble recalled in 1883 that the prophet Joseph told him that the doctrine of celestial marriage was revealed to him while he was engaged on the work of translation of the scriptures, Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible. But when the communication was first made, the Lord stated that the time for the practice of the principle was not yet arrived. Records show that the prophet was working with Genesis in February and March of 1831. There he would have encountered the accounts of polygamous patriarchs like Abraham and Jacob. 3 months later, he started on his missionary journey to the Lamanites. Polygamy and other religious sects in the 1830s. Besides Joseph Smith's early 1830s private teachings concerning plural marriage, LDS missionaries encountered polygamy among practitioners of various religions. Samuel Harrison Smith, Joseph's brother, recorded in his diary on July 1, 1832, held a meeting at Fanny Brewer's, in the forenoon preaching, and in the afternoon partook of the sacrament, prayer meeting in the evening. Somewhat interrupted this day in the meeting by a man and woman that taught the doctrine of the devil, such as abstaining from meat and having spiritual wives, and so forth. They came to our meeting. Orson Hyde encountered a separate group of spiritual wife proponents on October 11, 1832. Went down to Gunkett's, about 3 miles, and again preached to a congregation of Cochranites who gave liberty. told them again to repent and go up to Zion, and we lifted our cry in the Spirit. And I hope some of them will go. But they had a wonderful, lustful spirit because they believed in a plurality of wives, which they called spiritual wives, knowing them not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. But by the appearance they know one another after the flesh. Jacob Cochran, the group's founder, was prosecuted in 1819 for adultery. The National Intelligencer reported on November 19, Jacob Cochran, the notorious preacher and leader of a new party of religious zealots in this country, has been sentenced by the Supreme Court, now sitting at Alfred, to 13-day solitary imprisonment and 4 years hard labor in the state's prison for the crime of adultery. On the other 3 indictments, for lewdness, fornication, and adultery, he has not yet been tried. 1830's accusations of polygamy against the church. Elizabeth A. Clark and Herbert Richardson observed, 19th century America abounded in utopian societies. As many as 500 such communities may have flourished in this period. Some experimented with novel marital and sexual practices which focused suspicion upon all the groups. Mario Stephen D. Phillis observed, polygamy should be mentioned as another communitarian institution, if only because it is interpreted in almost every other way. There is no need to cite the vast and sometimes obscene literature or to refute any of its bizarre claims. Suffice it to say that polygamy was first of all typically communitarian, and that very many communitive sects experimented with sex and marriage. Early Latter-day Saint efforts to live the law of consecration, which sustained traditional monogamy, were misunderstood. The Evangelical Magazine and Gospel Advocate, Utica, New York, reported in their February 5, 1831 issue, they, the Mormons, have all things in common and dispense with the marriage covenant. Henry Carroll, who was in the Kirtland area in 1832, recalled in 1885, it was claimed all things were common, even to free love, among the Mormons at Kirtland. Writer John L. Brooke wrote, among the non-Mormons in Ohio, there were suspicions that the community of property dictated in the law of consecration included wives. Historian Mark Staker observed, as late as 1835, Joseph was still trying to counter outside rumors that had apparently arisen as a result of the Morley family and early Mormonite confusion before his arrival in Kirtland. Several descriptions of the Morley family who joined the church in Kirtland used terms frequently applied to Owenite communities, such as calling them communistic. One observer said they practiced free love. No one in the Morley family ever says what they believed or did as a group, ever. Allegations of matrimonial improprieties followed the church, inciting a variety of denials. The April 1833 Evening and Morning Star clarified, it has been reported that the church had settled in this country, Independence, Missouri, and were living as one family. This is not so. Eventually, Joseph Smith addressed this concern in an 1840 article in the Times and Seasons. When we consecrate our property to the Lord, it is to administer to the wants of the poor and needy according to the laws of God. And when a man consecrates or dedicates his wife and children to the Lord, he does not give them to his brother or to his neighbor, which is contrary to the law of God, which says, Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. He that looketh upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery already in his heart. Now for a man to consecrate his property, his wife and children to the Lord, is nothing more nor less than to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the widows and fatherless, the sick and the afflicted, and do all he can to administer to their relief in their afflictions, and for himself and his house to serve the Lord. In order to do this, he and all his house must be virtuous, and shun every appearance of evil. Now if any person has represented any things otherwise than what we now write, They have willfully misrepresented us. Though the practice of plural marriage was on Joseph Smith's mind during the 1830s, he did nothing toward instituting it among the members of the church he had established until his move to Nauvoo. Except for a few recorded vague statements regarding the practice, it was a notion left unexplored. To read more about the practice of polygamy in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, check out Joseph Smith's Polygamy, Toward a Better Understanding.